At the beginning of 2005, Wales lifted the famous Six Nations trophy and claimed their first Grand Slam in 27 years. The team had set the tournament alight with an expansive and exciting brand of rugby, all masterminded by their head coach, Mike Ruddock. Ruddock had only taken over from Steve Hansen 12 months before, and in that short time restored some pride and a real feel-good factor back into Welsh rugby again, something that had certainly been missing for a long time. But, just like most things in Welsh rugby, behind the scenes, things weren't as good as they seemed, and that feel-good factor certainly wouldn't last very long. Fast forward a year and Wales would be humbled in their Six Nations opener at Twickenham, quickly putting to an end any thoughts of defending the title they'd won just 12 months ago. Ruddock, in fairness, would steady the ship, beating Scotland in the Millennium Stadium the following weekend, and restore some calm back into the Welsh fans. But 2 days later, like a bolt out of the blue, he would shock the rugby public and resign from his post as head coach, leaving everyone in Wales stunned and confused. I mean, you've seen some crazy things in Welsh rugby, but a coach resigning halfway through the tournament, this was a new one for the books. So what the hell went on? Well, immediately following this, there was a huge amount of rumours flying around over what had happened and who was responsible. Ruddock himself had stated that he was resigning for family reasons, though no one really bought this, and it didn't really make sense for him to quit mid-tournament. Immediately, the players came under scrutiny. There was a lot of noise coming out of the camp that some of the senior players didn't agree with Ruddock's tactics and training methods. Now, this of course is no surprise. Anyone who's been part of a team, whether it's a sport or work, has been to the point where they don't agree with the instructions they've been given by their boss or manager. It's just a normal part of an organisation, and not every coach is going to get on with every player. But you don't have the power to just go and get your manager sacked, which is a real shame actually, to be honest. Adding to the rumour mill though was the fact that skills coach Scott Johnson had apparently been called into the office of the head coach some weeks before and told to stop undermining him to the players. For some background, Johnson had initially been brought in by Graham Henry in 2002 as a skills coach, and he was highly sought after and was known as a little bit of an attack guru. Johnson then stayed in his post through Steve Hansen's tenure and had been serving as an assistant to Mike Ruddock. The problem was, Johnson was extremely popular throughout the squad. He was a friend to all and was highly respected for his rugby knowledge. Some people even speculated that some of the players wanted him as the head coach and thought he deserved more credit than he actually got. So, it's easy to see how tension and resentment could build between Ruddock and Johnson, especially when senior players were involved and they had a lot of influence over their teammates. What really added fuel to the fire though is it had come to light that some of the senior player group had met with Chief Executive Steve Lewis in the weeks prior to Ruddock leaving. Apparently these players consisted of Captain Gareth Thomas, Stephen Jones, Martin Williams and Brent Cobain. There may have been others, but I couldn't find any other names. Now, these meetings did happen from time to time, and it was generally for players to air out any issues or grievances they had with things like contracts and stuff like that. But by all accounts, in the most recent meeting, Ruddock's name had been raised. In what context though, obviously we'll never know, but it was definitely brought up at some point. So the rumour mill was in full flow. Some people were blaming the WRU, others were blaming Scott Johnson, but most of the heat was directed at the players. And most of the local papers were running with the story that player power had ousted Wales's head coach. Now, this was in 2006, and social media was not like it is today. If these rumours were flying around now, and players wanted to give their side of the story, they could just do a statement on Twitter, or maybe a video explaining the situation on Instagram, something like that. But back in 2006, there wasn't really an option to do something like this. So, whilst the players were taking a bit of a bashing in the paper, Captain and one of the main accused, Gareth Thomas, decided that he would defend himself and his team on Scrum 5 the following Sunday. Now, you have to imagine if this was the current day and age, that someone, literally anyone, would have stopped Alfie going onto the panel show. He was clearly unprepared and was going to get grilled by people, with all due respect to him, who were far more eloquent. On the panel that evening was Gareth Lewis, Jiffy and Eddie Butler. Years later, when talking on the Slam TV series, Alfie recounts that as he sat down and they were counting down for the cameras to start the show, Gareth Lewis, who was the main presenter, leaned over and said, quote, "Sorry for what's about to happen." What followed is absolute car crash TV and will probably go down as one of the most embarrassing TV moments in Welsh rugby history. Alfie tries to explain that the players had nothing to do with Mike leaving and that we should just take Mike for his word that he's leaving due to family reasons. He also states when asked, was Mike's name brought up to Steve Lewis? And in fairness, he admits it was, but says Steve Lewis said, quote, "Stop there, that's nothing to do with me."
I agree. I've met Steve Lewis with senior players. We meet Steve Lewis on a regular basis. We have meetings about contractual issues, payment issues, money issues,
and has
anything
Mike
to
Ruddock's
do.
coaching been discussed in those meetings?
When the last meeting we had, when we brought up Mike Ruddock's name, Steve Lewis said, "Stop there, I have nothing to do with this."
So, obviously, the panel didn't really buy it, and a heated clash between Thomas and former Welsh captain Eddie Butler began. Butler calmly asked questions and cites his sources, saying that there has been a few issues with Mike's coaching dating back months, and Alfie just gets more and more irate and stressed and seems unsure of how to deal with the situation that he'd put himself in, to be fair.
And this issue about the coaching is not an issue of the last 5 days. It's an issue of the last 5 months.
So why wasn't it brought up 5 months ago if it was an issue?
Well, exactly.
By you, because it wasn't an issue to me. You've said it was an issue. You're the one who mentioned it's an issue.
You weren't aware of the grumblings?
No.
You weren't aware that Mike Ruddock had to tell Scott Johnson...
You tell me who said to you 5 months ago there was an issue in the camp.
You
tell me. Tell us live on TV. Who said there was an issue?
Mike Ruddock had to say to Scott Johnson, "Stop undermining me."
And Mike has said that to you. Mike has said that live to the public, to the nation.
Well...
No, thank you.
He starts demanding that Butler outs his sources and claims that it's nothing but rumours. But obviously Butler doesn't out his sources, and a little bit of a back and forth goes on between the two men.
What? So what? If
no, you've just said it. Can you say yes or no? What's your answer?
I
yes
have
or no?
sources. I have sources which say.
Well, mate, I have sources.
Well, no. Well,
God, we all have rumours.
No, this is a source.
Well, tell us the source. Either say now live on TV the source, or don't even bother saying the subject.
Well, are you denying that meeting took place then?
Which meeting?
The meeting between Mike Ruddock and Scott Johnson, where Mike Ruddock said.
Am I denying it? Was I there? Was I supposed to be there?
James, let's get back to
I'm not denying it because I didn't know it even took place.
Gareth,
no.
Eddie,
let's just get back to that matter
in hand.
You don't know what's going on if such a meeting had taken place?
No. That's why I think it's important you let the source out. Otherwise, it's just another rumour. Yeah. Why should I have to say what my issue with Mike is when Mike knows it and I know it?
Well, because it obviously made him feel as if he was being undermined.
Oh, so you're saying I got him sacked now?
No. But you're going to the chief executive of the Welsh Rugby Union.
Which Mike already knew about.
Which Steve Lewis himself says is taking Mike Ruddock into the red zone. So we're talking about an offence which could end his career as Welsh coach.
How if he knows about it?
Well, so if he knew about it, he can't have been exactly happy. So you must have played some part in making him, as coach, feel weakened.
Interestingly, as the discussion winds down, Alfie offers a potentially Freudian slip as he mentioned that it wasn't just Mike who won the Grand Slam, but the players that laced up their boots and put their bodies on the line. And then he sort of slightly backtracks and says the credit should be spread evenly through everyone and that Mike would agree. Which, could be right.
Right, you're now questioning myself and Mike Ruddock together, our relationship as a captain, as a coach. I have played for 11 years for Wales. I've given my everything. I've won a Grand Slam. I've broken my thumb. What we need to remember here is that it wasn't just Mike who won the Grand Slam and who won all in games. We actually laced our boots up. Other coaches come in and helped. Other players went out and played and broke their bones. And now you're questioning...
Is that an issue with you, that Mike seems to have claimed too much credit then?
Of course it's not. You were given all the credit. I'm just saying, I think, as a captain, that we should let the credit spread everywhere. And Mike would agree with me.
It's both hilarious and tragic, all at the same time, and in all seriousness, watching this back, I cannot help but feel sorry for Alfie. I'm not saying he's without blame, and it was ultimately his decision to go on Scrum Five, but it's so painfully obvious that he's well out of his depth, and he's really struggling to keep a lid on his emotions. Ultimately, to be fair, was a brave decision going on national TV on his own to stand up for himself and his teammates. But funny enough, by all accounts, after the show, Thomas felt like things actually went quite well, and weirdly it seems like he wasn't the only one. And as I was reading back some of the comments from Jiffy, who was talking about the incident, he was saying himself that he was surprised that Alfie was going to be taking part in the show in the first place, and actually questioned whether it was a good idea, because he knew Gareth and he knew he was a passionate guy, and he knew that he could potentially let his emotions get on top of him. He was also a bit shocked by the fact that Rupert Moon, who was working for the WRU at the time as like a player representative, didn't really help Alfie out. Jiffy said, quote, "It wasn't live, it was pre-recorded, so all Rupert had to do was step in front of the camera and we could have run it all again. But he was behind the camera, giving it the thumbs up, going, yeah, job well done. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is berserk." Jiffy carries on saying, quote, "At the end, they shook hands and Alfie said, 'Good show, lads,' and then walked away. He thought it was a success. I went home and told my family, right, you have to watch this." End quote. And I guess that's just further testament to how out of his depth the Welsh skipper was in that situation. Unfortunately though, later on in the evening while watching the show back, I think it started to sink in just how bad things had actually gone. This would lead to Alfie to get so stressed that he would burst a blood vessel and suffer a mini stroke, hospitalising him and putting him out of rugby for 6 months. Just crazy. This whole debacle would leave Wales without their coach and their captain for the rest of the Six Nations. They'd gone from champions one year to the laughingstock the next. So what was the real reason that Mike Ruddock left under such a cloud? Some years later, when the Slam TV series came out, Ruddock appeared and gave his side of the story. He basically cited issues with the WRU and explained that he had been in the role for 2 years without a proper contract, and according to him, the WRU were not sitting down and giving him a genuine offer. Now this of course is fair enough. Anyone who knows anything about Welsh Rugby knows that the WRU has historically been run very poorly, and even right up to the current day that rugby in Wales has generally suffered and found mostly issues under their stewardship. So to hear the fact that no genuine offer was on the table makes total sense, and when you actually hear the other sources that were around at the time, you get more of a clear view of what those contractual issues were. In his book, Seeing Red, 12 Tumultuous Years in Welsh Rugby, which is an interesting read, and I'll put the link in the description if you want to have a look at it, Alan Carter, who was an analyst from the days of Graham Henry and who had, similarly to Scott Johnson, gone all the way through and was now working with Mike Ruddock, he shed some light on what was actually going on in camp at the time and what the issues with the contracts were. He says in his book, while quoting Ruddock, that there were 3 main problems with the contract being offered. He says, quote, "One of the most controversial points was a clause stating that the WRU chief executive, not the head coach, had final say on selection of the team." Now, just pause and think about that for a second. How is it possible for a head coach to do their job when they don't even get the final pick of the players to implement his game plan? It's just a joke. Apparently Steve Lewis did eventually back down and agree to have this clause removed, but it's just an example of the hubris of the people who were in charge of the WRU at the time. He continues to quote Ruddock saying, quote, "The second major issue was the grievance procedure. Any grievances I might have would end up on the table of Steve Lewis. There was no recourse for an independent arbitrator." End quote. So unprofessional again. With that logic, if Mike Ruddock had an issue with his boss, Steve Lewis, and wanted to make a complaint, he would have to complain to his boss, Steve Lewis, and not an independent HR department. It's just so amateur. And then finally, the third issue, he says, quote, "The third was the contract had to state that all of the coaches were to report to me. This was a major problem as Clive Griffiths didn't have a contract on offer and Scott Johnson wouldn't sign under any circumstances." End quote. So basically, under those circumstances, it was impossible for him to sign his own contract. It's totally understandable. What is interesting, though, is that he had been working under these circumstances for 2 years. So why did he, leave halfway through the Six Nations? Why didn't he leave before the Six Nations or at the end? Well, in my opinion, in there is another slip by Ruddock. The fact that he openly states that Scott Johnson wouldn't sign under any circumstances is a clear example of the split in power and the power struggle that was bubbling under the surface. This slip by Ruddock might have actually been on purpose to throw Johnson under the bus slightly, I don't know. But there is a few stories that have come out in the years since that are a clear indication that there was a divide. So going back to Alan Carter's book, we can find a couple examples of this. Quite a naughty one was after a heavy loss to New Zealand. Carter recounts walking into the change rooms with the coaches to find that Johnson had already sat down in there with the players. He says, quote, "The first thing I noticed on entering the room was Scott Johnson sitting in the back row amongst the players with his arms folded across his chest instead of sitting up front with Mike and Clive to lead the debrief," end quote. This to me sort of implies that he was taking the players' side over what the coaches were expecting and explaining, and was waiting for Mike to explain to him and the players why they lost the game. There's a few other stories of Johnson skipping meetings and stuff like that, but eventually it all came to a head with the aforementioned meeting between the two coaches, where apparently they cleared the air and Johnson was left visibly emotional and tearing at the end of the meeting. So looks like they sort of had a little bit of a come to Jesus moment and decided they were going to be friends. I'm not too sure. Unfortunately though, by this point I think the damage had already been done, and it seemed like the players had just lost all respect for Mike. And this leads me on to the third and main accusation, that it was the player power that was the undoing of the Welsh coach. Now, by all accounts, not long after the Grand Slam, quite a few players began to sour on Mike. Apparently they felt his coaching style wasn't particularly good. He was a bit too hands-off, and his Grand Slam success had basically been built on Graham Henry and Steve Hansen's work in the time prior to him getting the job. Gareth Thomas himself has been quoted saying that Mike did the right thing by not trying to change too much when he took over. Unfortunately though, the fact that the players thought this, coupled with Mike's less stern coaching style, discipline began to falter, and as soon as success on the pitch began to wane, then the players quickly began to point the finger at Mike, thinking he wasn't the right man for the job. Also, adding to the fact that a lot of players really did like Scott Johnson and thought that he was potentially a better coach than Mike, and a divide and a real drop in professionalism really began to tell. I'm not going to go into too many examples of this, but there is an example of Stephen Jones, who was, when being questioned about not following Mike's tactics on restarts, was really defensive and combative in front of everyone. So that sort of undermines Mike even further. But the main one that most people already know about was after Wales were humiliated in the Six Nations opener in the 2006. Mike had explicitly said to the players not to go out on a night out in London that evening. What happened though was a few players ignored the coach's wishes and still went out. Gareth Thomas speaks about this incident, saying that it would never have happened under the former regimes. Thomas even went as far as telling team manager Alun Phillips that some of the players were going to go out and he thought it was a bad idea, but it's because Mike had lost control of the team. What's funny though is that Thomas reported the incident to the team manager himself, but he was one of the culprits who was going on a night out, which is just laughable and a terrible example from your captain. In his book Alfie, he says, in his own words, "I went to our team manager Alun Phillips and told him a posse of our players, me included, were planning on heading into London that night. Even though I was intending to go, I did not think it was a good idea." This is just so stupid. If he's openly admitting that he knew his example he was setting was bad, then why was he saying no to the players and telling them not to go out and setting an example as a captain? He was very quick to say the reason he went on Scrum 5 to do the interview is because if he wanted to be the captain on the pitch, then he had to be the captain off the pitch too. So where was the leadership in this instance? My reading of it is that he knew this would further undermine Mike, and even though he knew it was a bad idea, he wanted Mike out, and he was happy to prove that Mike had lost the control of the dressing room. Pure speculation on my part, but that's just my opinion on the situation. According to Alan Carter, the final straw came in the Scotland game, saying the certain instructions at line-out had been ignored by the players, and they were just doing their own thing. Quoting Mike Ruddock, Carter says, "This isn't working. There's obviously a split in the camp. People aren't giving me the support I need. I'm just going to stand down at the end of the season." End quote. Obviously, it didn't last that long. As Ruddock and the WRU came to an agreement that he would step down at the end of the season, they quickly reneged on that and decided to terminate his contract with immediate effect. Very, very brutal. By all accounts, some of the players in camp were as shocked as we were, but others, they were not so shocked, apparently not surprised at all. Mike, who had brought a Grand Slam to Wales just 11 months prior, had unceremoniously been axed and, interestingly, replaced by the coach that had apparently been undermining him for some time, Scott Johnson. Not a good look for anyone involved. Some of the players, though, had finally got what they wanted, but Johnson's reign was not the second coming that they might have thought it was going to be, as Wales struggled under stewardship for 3 games, getting comfortably dispatched by Ireland, drawing with Italy and losing to France. And after all that, he wouldn't stick around for long and he would return to Australia almost immediately after, leading to the Gareth Jenkins era. But maybe that era is a discussion for another video. But that brings us neatly back to the beginning, where I posed the question, what was the real reason that Mike Ruddock resigned? And I must admit, before starting the research into this, I thought I would be able to find that one smoking gun that pointed to the exact issue of his resignation. But, of course, real life is far more nuanced than my little brain expected. The real reason Ruddock left was, well, to be honest, all of it. He hadn't had a proper contract for nearly 2 years, and his contract with the WRU that they were offering was simply unattainable for any self-respecting coach to agree to. Add to that, his assistant coach seemed more interested in getting to know the players and making them his friends, rather than be the right-hand man of the head coach. But what truly made it impossible for him to stay in his job was the fact that he'd simply lost the change rooms. When your players are not listening to you and your instructions, and the man you named as your captain and representative to the players is setting an example not befitting the role, then why would you even bother taking all that stress on you and your family? It was obviously just too much for him. Now, before I wrap up, it is important to say that I wasn't there, and only a couple of people, Mike, Gareth Thomas, maybe Steve Lewis, actually know what happened. And all I've given is my opinion from the information that I found. So I'm just saying, please, nobody sue me. Thanks for watching.